Welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. This is Foundations of Zend Framework in the 3rd edition. So Adam Culp will be enlightening us on all of the new exciting changes coming to Zend Framework. And Zend Framework 3, I imagine, is scheduled for release soon. Yeah, it's coming. So a lot of exciting changes though with it. And I've been following Zend Framework since before it was an application, and I've been really excited about everything that they've done. I'm excited to hear what Adam has to say about it. We'll have lunch right after this, so Adam, I guess if you need to go a little bit longer, you'll just be eating into their eating time.
There we go.
So,
there we go. We don't need to eat.
Yeah. So please, right after this, go down and we'll have lunch again. That's sponsored by Automatic. I'd like to thank them and the rest of our sponsors. But please give a warm welcome to Adam Culp.
For those of you who don't know me, I'm Adam Culp. You can find me on Twitter at Adam Culp. And please rate this talk when I'm finished. This talk is 16661 on Joined In, so please rate it. I talk a lot at conferences, and I do want to say a disclaimer though. Yesterday when I gave my talk, my shoulder hurt quite a bit because I injured it just 3 weeks ago skiing, or snowboarding rather. And so I'm going to put my hand in my pocket, and I think that'll work out better for me. So I apologize. Normally I'm much more animated with my hands, but this one's going to stay still. And I'm not going to use a mic. If you're not able to hear me, then please speak up and tell me I can use a mic, but I'm going to try without it. This is a small enough room. I think I project well enough. You can hear me back there all right? All right, cool. So for those of you who have seen my talks, this is going to be a little bit of rehash for one slide, which is just about me. I apologize. But for those of you who don't know me, I'm a PHP 5.3 certified engineer. I work for Zend Technologies. I'm an employee of Zend. I'm a consultant, so I'm not a salesperson. I'm not here to sell Zend products. I'm a consultant. I help companies create better architecture, create better code, refactor old legacy applications, or whatever the case might be. If the Zend tool happens to fit their need, I recommend it. Otherwise, I don't sell the products. I'm there to consult and help people do coding. I'm the organizer of South Florida PHP User Group. We have about 800 members in South Florida. And I'm also the organizer of Sunshine PHP, which is coming up in just 3 weeks in Miami. There's a lot worse places you can be in February than Miami. So if you want to come down for some more weather in 3 weeks, please come down and join us. It's going to be a great conference. We do about 350 attendees, so it's a good-sized conference. I'm a long-distance ultra runner. For those of you who don't know what that is, a marathon is 26.2 miles. Ultra means more than. I run more than 26.2 mile races. I've done 50 miles. I've done 100K, which is about 62 miles. And I've gotten as high as 73 miles on my way to try to do 100. I haven't done 100 yet. I would like to do a 100-mile race, but I haven't completed one yet. I've tried 100 miles twice, and 73 is as far as I've gotten so far. And I'm also a judo black belt instructor. I instruct judo for a lot of young children in the area in South Florida. I bring that up just to tell a little bit about me, and also I'm a big fan of iteration, and that's what we do. We're developers, so we do iteration pretty much everything we do. So Zend Framework, that's what we're here to talk about today. Zend Framework 3, more appropriately. So Zend Framework 3, from a programming standpoint, doesn't really have a lot of changes from Zend Framework 2. We didn't do a lot of huge sweeping changes. Most of the things that you do in Zend Framework 2, you can still do in Zend Framework 3. So a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about, you might look at it if you're already developing in Zend Framework 2. How many are doing Zend Framework 2 already? Okay. So some of the things I'm going to show, you may look at it and say, I do it that way now, and that's perfectly fine because Zend Framework 3 is pretty backwards compatible with it. This talk is more about showing how to use Zend Framework versus a 2 versus 3. Okay, I'm not going to tell you Zend Framework 3 does this and 2 doesn't. That's not the purpose of this talk. The purpose of this talk is to help people use Zend Framework 3, and you can use Zend Framework 2 with most of what I talk about as well. So Zend Framework 3 is going to support PHP 5.5 or higher, and it also supports PHP 7. So if you're looking to migrate to PHP 7 and you're using Zend Framework 2.5 or higher, you can use it on PHP 3 or PHP 7. So just know that. A is open source, it's available on GitHub. It has a diverse install base. You can either use Pyrus to install it, you can use Composer, which is recommended, that's why I have it bolded there, or you can use Git submodules. It uses the MVC design pattern. Now, the Zend framework as of 2.5 or higher, and again, 2.5 is mostly what's making up 3. Some things have recently been tagged as 3, like the event manager or the service manager, just the other day as a matter of fact. But 2.5 or higher is pretty much what Zend Framework 3 is going to be. And it is very componentized now. Instead of just installing Zend Framework 3 and it brings all your components in, now it is actually bringing in all the separate components. There's a separate Git repository for every component of Zend Framework now. If you are installing via Composer, you will find that when you're installing Zend Framework 3 as a full stack framework, you will run into rate limits. GitHub will tell you, sorry, I can't do that. Actually, Composer will fail and say, sorry, GitHub's telling us I can't do that. You will have to do an API key in order to download that many separate libraries. And large PHP applications have come across that as well. With Zend Framework 3, it's that way. So the recommended way to get Zend Framework up and running is to use the Zend Skeleton application. Using the Zend Skeleton application, you can find it on GitHub under Zend Framework Zend Skeleton application, and you can use that as a starting point. You don't have to, but it's an easy way to get up and running, right? Because Zend Framework 3 is Zend Framework 2 and 3 are so configurable that you can pretty much use any structure you want to, but the skeleton application is a good beginning structure. To install it via Composer, I'm not going to talk about the other methods, I'm only going to talk about Composer. It is the recommended way. You can clone the skeleton application or download it as a zip file and then run Composer install. When you do Composer install, it's going to create a vendor directory and it's going to dump all the Zend Framework 3 components in there. And as it does that, it's also going to create the Composer autoloader, which is PSR 0 compliant, or 4, either vice versa. The other more recommended way of doing it via Composer is to use create project. The create project command with Zend Framework skeleton application, and then it's going to do all the cloning and everything that's needed in order to bring down the skeleton application and install all the Zend Framework 3 components for you, all in one easy step. So that's the most recommended way to do it. These days, if you are creating a new project, whether it's Zend Framework 3, Symfony, or anything, you're pretty much going to use this. This is the standard way that most open source packages in PHP are working. When you do that, and whichever way you decide to get Zend Framework 3 up and running, your structure is going to be the basic structure like this. You have your project directory. Under that, you have a subdirectory for config. You have a data directory, which is where you would keep any additional text files, or if you have a SQLite database, something like that, you would put it there. Migrations for your database, put them there. You have your module directory with the subdirectories under it for each module. You have your public directory, which is going to be where you have your index.php, any CSS, any JavaScript, anything else like that. It would be front-end type things, and that is going to be your document root for your web server of choice. And then you have the vendor directory, which is where all of your PHP libraries are going to be dumped by Composer or by yourself if you put them in there. Now with Zend Framework 3, one thing to note is, as with Zend Framework 2, there is no magic. Zend Framework 2 and 3 is going to do pretty much what you tell it to do. There's no magic, there's no hidden mirrors, it's not automatically going to do something based on something else you do. Some frameworks tend to have some conventions where if you follow a certain convention, it's going to do certain things. And Framework 3 really doesn't do that. It is configuration driven. So by putting things into configuration, then you're telling Zend Framework 3 how to work, how to function. It's also, there's no force structure. You can change anything you want. If you want to use the skeleton application as a starting point, then you change that. For instance, maybe I put my module somewhere else or something like that. You can totally do that. And it uses namespaces. So the MVC structure, I'm not going to go into depth on that. Most of us know that. Does anybody not know the MVC design pattern? Okay, so I'm not going to talk much about that. I didn't include slides for it because it's a moot point these days. But with the MVC, I will say that you have your controllers in one place, you have your models, which also is generally going to contain your logic, your business logic, as well as your data. And then you have your view, which is going to be your representational layer. Or in the case of APIs, you have your data output, being kind of driven from there through the thing. Using the Zend skeleton application, the first file that you're generally going to have executed by the web browser calling it is your index.php. Through the index.php, this is where it kicks off your autoloader. And by default, it's going to use the PSR0 autoloader that is created by Composer for you, so you don't have to do that. And it's then going to call the application config.php. And that's pretty much all that you really need to do in the index.php, unless you're doing something more advanced that you might need to include something there. But by default, this is all it really does is, gets your autoloader up and running and tells it where to find the application config. The application config then is what loads all your modules. The application config, you put the list of the different modules to be executed in order to make up your application. And that's really most of what's in the application config. There's not much more there by default. Okay. You can put more there, but you want to keep it light. You want to make sure that you're keeping your application config very light. For the most part, it's just going to be where you're kicking off your modules. There are additional autoloader features that you can put in there for database settings and what have you. For the most part, your application config is going to be where you list your modules. Now, in your application config, as you're listing your modules, they are in order, right? So the order that you put your modules in your application config, that's going to be the order that the modules are loaded. Right? So if you find that you need one module in order for another one to work, shouldn't do that, but if that is the case, then if things aren't executing correctly, you might need to swap the way the modules are being loaded, because it is hierarchical. It just goes straight from top to bottom and loads them. As the modules are being loaded, the one convention that does hold true, no matter what structure you put in, is when a new module is loaded in Zend Framework 3, it's going to look for the module.php in that module. That's really the only thing that's required. You have to have the module.php. And the reason you have to have that is because your module.php is going to load all the configuration and everything needed for that module. It's going to, other than, it's going to do set your event manager, service manager items in there. It's going to set any parameters that need to be set for that module. And it's also going to define any services and wire up any event listeners as needed. We're going to cover those in a lot more depth here coming up. But let's finish going through the structure. So now that our index.php said application, here's our application. Application says here's your modules, and it starts loading the modules by looking at the module.php. One of the main things that is going to be in the module.php is where do I find the configuration for this module? Because each module has its own configuration. And that by default, or by convention, is going to be the module.config.php, and this is where all of your configuration per module is going to be housed. In there, you're going to have different containers. It's an array. The module.config.php is just a big array, and in that array, you're going to define your routes. You're going to define any navigation if you want to set it in there. It's an optional item. You can set your service manager items, your translators, controllers, view managers, anything like that you would need. That's going to be in your module config. And it's going to basically be the configuration for that module. One thing that I recommend, or one recommended item is don't use closures or anonymous functions, however you refer to them, in your module.config. There's a couple, actually one main reason for that. One main reason is your config files, generally to make your application run really fast, you're going to cache off those configuration files. Well, as you cache arrays, generally you're going to serialize them, or they're going to be serialized by whatever you're using for caching. When you unserialize an array that has been serialized, the anonymous functions no longer work. So it's recommended not to put anonymous functions in arrays. Instead, store the anonymous functions in your module.php if needed, and keep your module config just an array. Keep it just data items in there, no anonymous functions. So that's one gotcha that people commonly run into is one day they decide, you know what, let's just cache off all of our configuration files. Oh wait, why doesn't my application work? And it's generally because they do that. Also, it's a little bit less performant to do it that way, by storing, having closures and things in the module config. Now, a little bit about routes. So, as in the module config, one of the items that we're putting in there is our routes, right? And there's a few different kinds of routes. We'll kind of go over them briefly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but just kind of go through them briefly because they are pretty simple to use. It's just array items. The different types of routes that we can have is a host name where we're putting in a domain name, something like that. In this case, my example is we.adamculp.com. You could use literal routes where you put in the structure of your URL, like /home, /product, /cart, whatever the case might be. You could use a method type where you're specifying it's a post or a put, something like that. In the case of a post or a put, here's what to do. Here's how to react to those routes. You can also use a part, which creates a tree of possible routes, and you can nest those so you can get a real good tree structure set up. You can use regular expression to create a different route matching. You can use a schema like HTTPS or something like that. There's other schemas, but again, that's a good example to kind of indicate what that might be. Segment route is the other common one. Most common that you're going to find is either a literal route or a segment route. Those are the two most popular, the two most common that we run into in applications. The segment route is where you can kind of put in wildcards to say, okay, the first argument in our URL structure is going to be a controller, followed by an action. And you'll notice that those are in square braces, meaning it's optional to continue on. So in this case, the action is optional and the trailing slash is optional, but the controller is required in this case. So it's always got to have a controller. It might have an action, might have a slash on the end. Oftentimes, if you don't have this trailing slash here on the end as an optional item, and somebody does stick a slash on the end as they're typing the URL or something like that, it'll fail. And they'll be like, well, why is that failing? That belongs there. If there it exists. Well, it's because you didn't make the trailing slash optional. And you put it in, the route didn't match because it wasn't expecting a slash. So that's a good thing to put on there. Trying to put that on a literal does not work. Okay, so keep in mind that putting your conditionals in here in the way that we're doing in the segment route, that only works in the segment route. It does not work in a literal. I often have developers send me emails, hey, I'm setting up this route, I'm using these optional things, and it's just not working. And I say, well, are you using a literal route? Yes, that's why. It's real easy troubleshooting. There's also a query type where you can specify different capture parameters and things like that that you can put in. Be very careful with the query type because you can do a lot of things. You can really shoot yourself in the foot security-wise using query. I don't cover it much only because it's very rare to need it, and again, it's very touchy. The way a route looks, again, we have this is a module.config. We have an array where we're setting in the routers. We put in the different routes, our first one being the home, and we put in the route type. Actually, we have a type here of literal. I could have just typed literal, and in this case, I put the full namespace for literal. Doesn't matter. Either way it works. You can put the route itself is just slash. So that is my home route. And then you define what the home route is. Well, it's in the index controller, and then the index action, that's my home. Again, very simplistic example. This is by default what you would find in skeleton application when it's installed. And then you can set up child routes. There are child routes set up by default in the skeleton application. So all you have to do is just add actions to your controller, and they would work. You know, out of the gate. You don't have to do a whole lot. When I train folks on how to use Zend framework, I'll just basically have them start adding actions into the index controller. They're like, well, how are these working? Well, because your child routes are allowing that to work. If you need to get more specific, or if you want to type specific things, then you add additional routes, you know, to compensate for that.
Question.
Sure.
What does the main terminate do exactly?
So main terminate is when the routes are being parsed, right? When the URL comes in, Zend framework parses that. It's got to find the route. It's got to find how that route matches. So the main terminate says that if this is matched, don't bother going forward.
So that okay.
But if that was different, then it would say, okay, well, wait, that one matched, but continue going anyway. There might be a more defined route later that does better than this one. Usually it's very problematic if you don't.
Yeah.
It's something you have to play with, right? There are often times where just swapping the routes in and out using that may terminate wrong will yield undesirable things.
If it matches multiple routes, how does it determine? Is it the most?
It's going to be the last one.
Or
It's going to be the last
the
one.
last one. That
Yeah, whatever's last. It's an array, so it's going to be the last one in the array. And that's where that may terminate comes in handy, is you can say, well, hey, even if you match the first one, if there's another one later on, go ahead and use it. But with the may terminate being set, if it matches one, it's just not even going to try anymore.
Yeah.
You say, okay, I got a match, I don't need to do anything more.
So I'm pretty sure in ours it's always true, but
Yeah.
have you seen a case where it makes sense false?
There are, especially in APIs. When you're using an API where you might want to define the URLs a little bit more, you know, if you want to get silly RESTful, I don't like RESTful. I love REST, I hate RESTful. Because when people start building it RESTful, you see a lot of crappy URLs, you see a lot of crazy stuff. I like being just plain REST. You know, give me a good solid, you know, REST API that doesn't do all kinds of crazy URL things. You know, I want my API to be driven by put, post, delete, you know, things like that. Get. I don't want my URL to drive my application. I want HTTP to drive my application. But anyway, that being said, there are times where people are making RESTful APIs and the URL really is important, and you might want it to do different, more advanced things depending on your API.
Thanks.
And that, by the way, is where your method type would come in handy too. The method type put in post, if you have a RESTful API versus a REST API, you may want to specify this and then put child routes under that to do certain things depending on whether it's a put or a post. You know, and that's where that can come in handy. So let's talk a little bit about the event manager. Now that we've got our applications loading, right? We've got our config in there. We've got our routes. It's properly routing things. Then we come up to the event manager. Now there's a couple different types of event managers. First, the main event manager. The event manager itself. There's really only one event manager. There can be many events, but there's really only one event manager. So. And I wrote here you can have many event managers, and it kind of works that way, but you'll see more of what I mean when I talk about the shared event manager. So there are many different event managers that can be defined there. We generally define the event managers in this context to do different things. Each one is isolated. So if you're defining an event here, and then later on you define another event over here, you have two separate events. They are totally sealed off from each other. They do not see each other. You cannot make them cascade down. You cannot make them, you know, see each other's information, what have you, right? They are totally isolated. You cannot make them drive off of each other. Events are actions. So when an event happens, you are saying, okay, this happened, and that's my event. If this happens, that's the event, and then you create a trigger off of that action, right? And that's the way the event manager works. We generally create them, like I said, and then we use them to do certain things. Now, there are some default event managers, and in that, it's as the application is being kicked off. First, we have the bootstrap event, we have the route event, the dispatch event, render event, and finish event. These are the default ones in Zend Framework. There are multiple different listeners throughout each of these events. There's pre and post, there's other things happening in the middle. Now, at a couple of different points, as Zend Framework is executing, at a couple of different points, it will actually just halt execution. And that is when the route is not matched, then it'll come up with a dispatch error before the dispatch happens, right? Because if it doesn't have a route, it can't do anything. You know, it doesn't know what controller to kick off, it doesn't really know what to do. So we have to stop there. The next time there's a haltable area is after render. If it's trying to render and it's not able to render, there's an error. You know, hey, the view doesn't exist. You know, or this template's not there, something like that. Then it'll halt there before it goes forward to the finish. Once it gets to finish, it's done. It's going to output it to the screen. Whatever is going to be outputted will be outputted. But there's two different places where you have the halting events, excuse me, in that case. An example of event manager might be something like this, right? So in our module.php, we use the onBootstrap event. We're extending that from elsewhere. The MVC event itself actually gets dependency injected into the onBootstrap. So we have it available. By doing that, we can actually get the event manager from the application, right? We have to pull the application from the event, from the MVC event, and then we can have access to the event manager. Once we have access to the event manager, we can attach a new event to it. Now, when you are attaching events, it is recommended practice to use the constants that are available. You know, don't do any custom definitions or anything as far as that goes. You know, hinge off of one of the constants that are available for you. In this case, I'm using the event dispatch constant in the MVC event. And then we're telling it what to attach and then what to do. This is a callback, right? So this callback, I'm saying on dispatch, you know, that's my callback. If this event fires off, run the on dispatch method. The on dispatch method then attaches, it gets the view model, and then it sets a variable in the view model which sets my title. Yeah, very simple example of event manager, but you know, again, it's nonetheless that's how it works. Now, in addition to the event manager, there is the shared event manager. Now, in the shared event manager, it's considerably different. There's only one. There's only one shared event manager. Whereas there could be multiple shared events, or multiple events, there can only be one shared event manager. The shared event manager is similar to the event manager, and it is actually obtained through the event manager, but it's partitioned off to be separate. The idea behind the shared event manager is then it's globally available anywhere. It's shared. You know, so any part of your application can leverage the items in the shared event manager versus in the shared manager, or in the event manager. Sorry, I'm tripping over myself. It's globally available. So a time that we might want to use something like a shared event manager, maybe we wanted to execute something anytime a controller is loaded, right? Anytime a controller is instantiated and included, run this, right? As an event manager, we wouldn't be able to do that because they're partitioned off. They're separate. They don't know that each other is happening, right? Those events don't know that each other are happening. Whereas in the shared event manager, everything's globally aware. So that's where you can use it to actually do something like, you know, anytime a controller runs, do this. An example of the shared event manager would be in our onBootstrap event, or in our onBootstrap method rather. We're getting our event manager. Once we have the event manager, then we can get the shared event manager, and we can attach items to it. And notice here I'm actually including an anonymous function. We're telling it an interface to use, so that way we have a little bit more, we're pulling in the structure. And in this case, we're attaching a logger to it in the shared event manager, because again, we want it to be globally available, and that would be a logger, right? You want a logger to be available everywhere. Yesterday, I gave a talk on refactoring legacy applications, and one of the steps is to clean up global things, right? Because global is not good. The shared event manager kind of helps with that, because it does make things globally available, but it's not using logos. Yeah. But it's a little bit more. It's a little bit more easier to use like that. So in modern applications, generally for loggers and things like that, this is what we're using. We're using event managers in today's applications to do that versus using globals, because it does work kind of globally.
Would the DB layer be one that?
So the database layer would not be an event though. So again, this would be global where you rely on an event in order to do something. The database is different. Database, you want to use it like a service manager, which we're going to talk about here in a moment, because then you want it to be available as a service or some type of dependency injection container, something like that. That would be available globally without using globals, right? And so that's where that comes in. And again, this is an example of using the module.php. Now, some event manager characteristics, it is an object. Your event managers are an object, and you're creating triggers on those events in order to kick them off. And then you can also have callbacks, and using callbacks, it makes it really easy to enhance the functionality of it and make it a lot easier to test. I prefer using anonymous functions for those sort of things, because anonymous functions are a way of lazy loading. So that way your anonymous function, whatever is inside the anonymous function, is not going to be executed by PHP until the event actually happens. So it's a nice way to keep your code simple, keep it light by using anonymous functions, and they don't actually fire off until the trigger's queued. Your events are also queued by priority. When you're creating your triggers in your event, you're going to prioritize them, from 0 to 100 or even higher than that, whatever the case might be. So it's good to watch those priorities and make sure. Did I use priorities in here? No, I didn't. But you're going to assign a number so that way certain things can happen, and you can make some items bubble to the top and happen first, and other items come later. The event manager is it uses a couple different patterns, like a pub sub or an observer pattern, so that way it's easier to control them. The class that triggers the event is the publisher. The listener is subscribing to the event, so that way it happens in the case of a pub sub, or like as an observer. Your listener is the observer. The class triggering the event is the subject that's happening.
Is the higher the priority run first, or if the number is lower? Like is one high priority, or is 10,000?
So the higher the priority, the first it runs, right? So if you have it set to 1,000, 1,000 is going to happen before 1.
Okay.
Right.
Are events always queued, or can they be executed without queued?
Events are always queued. They're always queued, so that way, because it has to have the priority in order to know how to execute them, so they have to be added to a queue. Now you can do negative numbers as well in your priorities. So you can do -1 or -100 and things like that. You can go to negative in case you want to make sure that your items that you're having, that your triggers are happening after Zend Framework does things, right? So Zend Framework does things at a 0. If you have something that you want to happen after that, then you would give it a negative number, so that way it fell later in the string, or later in the stack. A little bit about services. So services, first off, everything is a service in Zend Framework. Everything is a service. All the controllers are services. So as you're loading controllers, as you're loading everything in Zend Framework, framework, it is loading as a service. It's factory-based containers. It's the way it runs. And you can create services from either the application configuration, the module classes, or the module configuration. You can also do local overrides in the configuration. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the overrides are going to happen last in the priority. As you're loading your services, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute, so let me not get there now. But you just want to make sure that your services are happening in the right order, because it does, however you're doing your overrides, that could affect things. And the order in which they're labeled here, application configuration, module classes, module configuration, and local overrides, this is the order that services are created. So if I'm creating a service in my local override, and it's named the same as something that's in the application configured the module class, it's going to override. Right? Oftentimes people will name something, accidentally name it the same, and they're like, it's not giving me what I expected. Well, you named it the same and you made it last, right? So it's overriding the first item. You want to beware of naming along with that, right? Make sure your services are named appropriately. Use fully qualified class names if you're able to. One thing that I haven't done is I haven't updated this slide deck. I apologize for that. A convention, if in newer versions of PHP, is where you're using the class definition. So you can specify : class to come up with your fully qualified class name. And you can actually use that instead of using the namespace definition, right? If you don't know what I'm talking about, come see me afterwards. I can show you an example. I just don't have an example on a slide here. I apologize for that. But it is the convention of how to do things nowadays to make sure that you're getting good naming using fully qualified class names. And it's automated using PHP itself. The functionality in version, I think it's 5.4 or above. Yeah, 5.4, version 5.4 is where they started doing the class name definitions like that. Make sure you're descriptive. If you're not using a fully qualified class name, make sure you have very descriptive names, right? It's recommended to use a fully qualified class name, but if you must differ from that, make sure you're using something very descriptive. And I recommend using hyphens versus using slashes or something like that. And part of the reason behind that is because all of your keys are going to get normalized anyway. Now in Zend Framework 3, they changed that, but since that's not in production yet, I can just say that they did change it. Everything's not really going to get as normalized the way it was in ZF2. Right? In ZF2, everything's normalized, so this /app /controller /product /index is exactly the same as app -controller -product -index. They're normalized, so it really doesn't matter. But in Zend Framework 3, these would be different. Okay, I haven't updated that slide either. I need to update that. But again, it's not in production yet, so it's still being developed. At the moment, the idea is to not normalize it and allow the use of things like that and make them different. The hierarchy of definitions. Does that bell mean something?
Not to me.
So I was ready to get out of the way because someone's riding a bike behind me or something. Running the miles that I do whenever I'm on a sidewalk, I always listen for the bike bells because people will bling bling, oh, get out of the way before you hit me. Hierarchy of definitions. So again, the hierarchy is important in the way that definitions are being created. First, your module.php is going to be your initial place where definitions are being loaded. Then your module.config.php would override anything in the module.php if the names were the same. And then you have your local overrides, which would be like the module config.php, and you add them in the local overrides. They would override anything there. So again, this hierarchy of how things would be overwritten based on how you're defining them. There are different service types. Naturally, because everything is a service, you need to define it, right? So in the different service types, first of all, there is the services type. of service, which is explicit. It's just key value pairs. Right? So you have a name, you have a value, and that's where you define that service. I'm going to show you an example of that type in just a moment. Next, you have your invocables, where you're actually you're giving it a class, a fully qualified class name, and telling it where to find it, and it is going to instantiate that as an invocable and make it available in the services. And then, of course, you have factories, much the same as invocables, but a factory is where it requires something in order to get running, right? So you create a factory so that way you can have more control over how your object is being created versus just, create this object, doesn't need anything, just create it. You can also create aliases where any name or any service that was created prior, you can give it a new name and say, okay, here's another name for that, and create an alias for it. Abstract factories, much like factories, but you can anonymize them in a way that if you needed to, through iteration or some sort of looping, you needed to create the factory with a different name depending on how it was being done. You would use abstract factories. Scope containers limit what's contained, or limit what's created, because then you can have it within a certain container, and then you have shared or not. You would decide that. So as an example, this is the module .config.php. Again, it's an array, so we're creating our module manager array item. Under that, we have our abstract factories. You might have an invocables here. I don't have an example of that in this slide. But again, we're having the fully qualified class name and telling it where it's going to find that. Key value pairs for factories. You have aliases where we're renaming an alias. And then a defined services type. In this case, I'm just creating a simple example of I got a key, and that key carries this array, right? There's a product categories, car, truck, boat, just a very simplistic example. You might actually want to connect to a database to get that, but again, I just wanted this to be here for simplicity to show you. Now, alternatively, you can do the same thing in your module.php. You create the function getServiceConfig. From there, you return an array, and you can define a services type service much that way as well. It works exactly the same. You can do it in the config, or you can do it in the module.php. Either way is fine. Both work the same. It's all about what you want to use. So generally, if you want to have some sort of anonymous function in, you would do this method, because then you can put your anonymous function in the module.php rather than in an array. So that way, if you were to cache your array, your configuration arrays, then you don't run into issues. So using a service example, so we've created our service, now we want to go back and use it. So in this case, the onDispatch method in my module.php, I'm actually calling the service from the MVC event. I'm getting the service manager from the application, and then I'm setting the variable. I'm doing the service manager get, and I'm calling the product categories that I created as a services type service. And then in my view, I'm able to use that categories item. In this case, I'm using the HTML helper HTML list, so it's going to create an unordered list for me simply by calling that service. So again, in the module.php, I'm pulling the service items, and I'm using it in my view. In this case, the layout. Using services in a factory is a little different, but not by too much. So here I've got my categories controller factory, and in the factory, I'm using the control manager as a service locator interface. I'm calling the new categories controller because that's ultimately what we wanted to do, but we wanted to use the factory so we can populate the services. So it's going to return the controller, the controller that we want to do, but we're going to do it through the factory so that way we can set the categories in that manner, and then we're able to return the categories controller with the categories created for us. Right? So this is using a factory to do much the same thing. Not a whole lot different for ZF2 from ZF3 so far, right? It's all pretty similar. Module manager, so the module manager, is where, I probably should have put this a little bit earlier, I'm going to change those later. But the module manager is where, the idea behind the module manager is to compartmentalize our application to do different things. So you have a module to do one thing, solve a problem, right? And you can kind of break that up. You should keep your application compartmentalized in modules. It's recommended not to have one big, huge application, right? Instead, break it up into multiple modules and let the module manager manage that. You can get directives from the application config. That's where we define the modules to be loaded by the application. The modules must be in order. And then you also tell it where to find the modules. Now, by convention, the skeleton application says to find those in the modules directory of the framework or the skeleton application, or in the vendor directory, look for modules there. And again, each module, the one convention is done is module.php is loaded. The module.php specifies where to find the configuration. By default, that's going to be the module.config.php. And then it hands everything off to the MVC event so that the bootstrap process can kick in. Now with module basics, as a module basic, we want to keep our modules separated so that way a module handles a problem, right? So anytime you have a new problem that you need to tackle in your application, you create a new module for that. So that way it's on the side. That makes it easy for reuse. If you've got all your different problems or different solutions to the problems like that, if you create a second application for that same company, you can just include that module, right? You don't have to recreate it again. You just pull this module, pull that module, pull that module, put it in this application. It's the same company, it's the same business logic. So let me just pull that and dump that in as I need it in my other applications, right? You can even create packages and then use Composer. You know, in the case of a company, you might want to do that locally versus making it public, but you can do that, and it's a lot easier to load those modules for code reuse. One thing to keep in mind is in your modules, keep your init and your bootstrap in your modules very light, right? Because they're going to be executed every single time that something is done in the module. So you want to keep those items light and do not add to the module structure. Now the modules, the content of the modules is going to contain your PHP code, any MVC functionality, library codes, view scripts, public assets, and more. I mean, you can create images, CSS, JavaScript, all that in there. It's recommended if you're using a Zend skeleton application, use a Zend skeleton module as well. So that way you have the base structure. It's nice and easy to create modules doing this. You clone this down or download the zip file, add it into your modules, do some renaming, and now you have a module. It's nice and easy, very quick to get things up and running. Now some other things that are a little bit more advanced that I'm not going to get into too much here due to time is in Zend Framework 3, we now have the concept of middleware and using PSR7 compliant middleware. I'd encourage you to check that out. It is now baked into Zend Framework 3, so that way you can use middleware and PSR7 compliant middlewares. A lot of good stuff on that. There's a lot of good posts about that out on the web currently, and you'll see a lot more about it coming forward. That's beyond the scope of this beginning foundations talk, but some other things would be views. There's a lot more advanced things you can do with views. I don't cover them a whole lot because in today's modern applications, most people are using templating of one form or another, whether it's plates or twig or what have you. I would encourage you to use some form of view templating. Plates is nice. Plates is very similar to the way Zend Framework works out of the box, with the HTML files. Plates is very similar, but you still get the benefit of templating and things along that line. The form manager in Zend Framework is very robust. Again, a little bit more advanced databases, navigation, which is not default, but it's available, and different view strategies. By default, the Zend skeleton application leverages the action strategy patterns. However, you can use RESTful patterns to do a lot of things in an automated sort of fashion if you're creating a REST API. Really good stuff there. I have some examples of that. I think I have the URL here. If you search for me on GitHub, Adam Culp on GitHub, I do have a Zend framework skeleton application basic structure set up there, and it actually does use RESTful controller as well as the action controller, depending on the module that you're looking at. So you can see good examples of how to use that. I need to update them a little bit, but for the most part, the structure's there, and you can get some good usable information. Some good resources. Framework.zend.com is a great resource for learning about Zend Framework. Right now, that site is mostly Zend Framework 2. It's not Zend Framework 3, but you're going to see that be revamped here really soon. We don't have a time frame for it yet. As with all open source projects, it depends on contribution. As more people contribute to that, we're going to be good. There is lots of Zend Framework 3 documentation available. If you go out on GitHub, every component of Zend Framework on GitHub, there is also documentation, full documentation for ZF3 of how to use it and how to go from 2 to 3. In some cases, if there's some functionality that you need to. I encourage you to check that out in the individual GitHub repos. That's going to be used for the future documentation sites, which will probably be public in the next quarter. So you'll see a lot more on that. Some different training courses that are available. A Zend Framework 2 cheat sheet, which allows you to see the execution of Zend Framework and how the event manager and everything are instantiated throughout the thing. Also encourage anybody to check out appagility.org if you're creating APIs. It uses Zend Framework too, but it makes creating an API really easy using some of the conventions. There's also Strategility and strategility.org and Zend Expressive, thank you. Zend Expressive, which uses Zend Framework 3 along with the middlewares, and a lot of good things happening out there with those applications. I encourage you to check those out. Again, I'm available for questions. We're out of time, but please go out and rate the talk. And there's my repo, GitHub, Adam Culp, Foundations-ZF2-talk. I've got some code samples available for some of the things I showed. There's a lot more advanced code samples than I can possibly cover in a 50-minute talk. Again, Zend Framework is much bigger than a nutshell, so covering it in 50 minutes is a lot. You can also find more about me in different blog posts about Zend Framework and other things on my blog, geekyboy.com, and I also have a podcast, rungeekradio.com. I welcome you to listen to it and enjoy. Thank you very much for coming.